She was 56 years old, and she found out her marriage was over from a sticky note on the refrigerator. Not a letter, not a conversation. A yellow sticky note, stuck crooked over the grocery list she'd written that morning that said, "Gone to Brenda's. Don't call. Lawyer will be in touch." 29 years of marriage, and the last word he ever left her was on a post-it that couldn't even hold a straight line. Before we go any further, if this kind of story hits something in you, do us a favor and drop a comment down below, telling us where in Canada you're watching from tonight. We've got people writing in from Moose Jaw, from Corner Brook, from way up in Yellowknife, and it means the world to us to know who's out there listening. If you're new here, hit subscribe because we tell these quiet stories every single week. Real stories about the people nobody expects to come back from anything. Now let's get back to her. Her name was Doreen Kowalchuk, and she had grown up outside Swift Current, Saskatchewan, on a piece of land so flat you could watch a truck coming for 10 minutes before it ever arrived. Her father, a man named Casimir, had been a Ukrainian-Polish mechanic who fixed combines for every farmer within 60 miles, and never once raised his voice that Doreen could remember, not even the year the bank came for the equipment. Her mother had died young, of something nobody talked about back then, and Casimir had raised Doreen mostly alone in a house that smelled like engine grease and rye bread. What Doreen remembered about her father, and what she had spent 38 years trying not to remember, was the year he left. She was 14. He packed one suitcase, told her he was going up north for work, and she did not see him again until she was 17, when a lawyer's letter told her he had died of a heart attack in a rooming house in Thompson, Manitoba, alone, with nothing to his name but a truck and some tools. Her aunt had raised her the rest of the way, and her aunt had told her, more than once, over the kitchen table, that some men just aren't built to stay, that some men run when things get hard. And Casimir Kowalchuk had run from a 14-year-old girl who needed her father, and there was no forgiving a thing like that, no matter how good he'd been before. Doreen had carried that story her whole life like a stone in her coat pocket. It was there when she married Glenn at 22, a young man from Regina who worked at the co-op, and told her she was the steadiest thing he'd ever known. It was there when they moved to Moncton for his job, and she found work doing the books for a trucking company. Quiet, careful work that suited a woman who had learned early that people leave and numbers don't. It was there through the 2 miscarriages they never spoke of again, through Glenn's mother's slow decline, through 29 Christmases and 29 anniversaries, and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being married to a man for 3 decades, and slowly realizing you've become furniture to him. And it was there on the Tuesday in March when she came home from work to find his side of the closet empty, and a sticky note on the fridge. There was $412 in the joint account. Glenn had been quietly moving money to a separate account. For over a year, the lawyer would later tell her, ever since he'd started up with a woman named Brenda from his curling league. Doreen was 56 years old, and she sat at her kitchen table with a bank statement in her hand, and she thought with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, so this is how it happens. This is how a woman becomes nothing in the space of one Tuesday afternoon. The house sold within 2 months, because Glenn wanted it sold, and after the lawyers took their cut and the mortgage was settled, Doreen was left with $11,000 and a 2009 Honda Civic with 190,000 kilometers on it. She had no children to lean on. She had no siblings. What she had was a name on an old yellowed envelope her aunt had kept for decades and never given her. An envelope that surfaced only because her aunt was dying now too, in a home in Yorkton, and had asked Doreen to come clean out her apartment. Inside the envelope was a deed, a single sheet of county paper from the province of Manitoba, dated 11 years earlier, transferring ownership of a property to Doreen Kowalchuk in the event of her father's death, a property her aunt had apparently paid the back taxes on quietly, every single year, without ever once mentioning it, because Doreen's aunt had never forgiven Casimir either, and some part of her had wanted that shame buried along with him. The property was a roadhouse, the Northern Star Roadhouse, on a stretch of Highway 6 outside Thompson, Manitoba, on the old road up toward Lynn Lake, where the boreal forest goes on so long and so dark that truckers still call it the Blackwater Stretch. Assessed value, $1. It had been condemned for tax purposes decades ago and simply never demolished, sitting empty on a strip of land the county didn't want and nobody had bothered to buy. We want you to sit with that for a second, because we think it's one of the strangest, most humbling things a person can feel. Here was a woman who had just lost everything a life is supposed to be built on, a husband, a house, a future she thought she understood. And the only thing left standing for her in the whole world was a $1 Roadhouse that had belonged to a father she believed had abandoned her. If you've ever felt like the ground gave out under you all at once, tell us in the comments, because we hear from so many of you who have. Doreen almost didn't go. She told herself for 2 weeks that it was pointless, that it was probably falling in on itself, home to raccoons and rot, and that driving 11 hours north in a car with worn brake pads to look at a dead man's failed business was not a plan. It was a way of avoiding the plan she actually needed to make. But her aunt, from the hospital bed in Yorkton, gripped her hand with more strength than Doreen thought she had left, and said one thing that stuck. "Your father wrote to me every year, Doreen. I never told you because I didn't know what to do with it. He wrote every single year until the year he died." That was the first time in 38 years anyone had told Doreen her father had thought of her at all. So she drove north. She drove up through Winnipeg, through the pass, up into country where the trees get shorter and the sky gets bigger, and the radio stations disappear one by one until there's nothing but static and wind. She drove until the highway narrowed to 2 cracked lanes with frost heaves that made the Civic shudder, past nothing but rock and muskeg and the occasional burned-out gas station, until a hand-painted sign faded to almost nothing appeared on the shoulder. Northern Star, rooms, hot coffee, 4 km. The Roadhouse sat back off the highway behind a stand of black spruce, a long low building of gray, weathered log, with a sagging porch roof and a hand-carved wooden star nailed above the door. Its paint long gone silver white from 40 winters. Doreen sat in her car for a long time before she got out, engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at the place the way you look at a stranger's face that reminds you of someone. Inside it was exactly what she expected and nothing like what she expected at the same time. Dust? Yes. A collapsed shelf of canned goods gone to rust? Yes. Mouse droppings and the smell of cold wood smoke that had settled into the log walls so deep it would probably never leave. But behind the front desk, where a check-in counter should have been, was something Doreen had not expected at all. A wall of small brass hooks, 30 of them in 3 neat rows, each one labeled with a hand-carved wooden number, and on 29 of those hooks hung a key. Hook number 14 was empty. She stood there a long time looking at that one empty hook the way you'd look at a missing tooth. We'll admit something to you here, because we think it's worth admitting. When we first heard this part of Doreen's story, we thought, same as you're probably thinking right now, that hook 14 was going to be nothing. A missing key, lost to time, nothing more. We were wrong, and we think you're going to feel the way we felt when you find out why. Doreen didn't have the money to fix the place up, and she didn't have anywhere else to be, so she did the only thing that made sense to a woman raised by a mechanic who never threw anything away. She started cleaning, 1 room at a time, to see what was there before she decided what to do with it. She used the last of her savings to pay a local man named Walter Feshkuk, an old-timer from Thompson who'd known her father slightly, back when Casimir used to fix trucks for the mine, to help her clear the worst of the rot and get the power and water running again. Walter was quiet, careful, the kind of man who didn't waste words, and when he found things in that building, he didn't touch them until Doreen was standing right there beside him. It was Walter who noticed 3 weeks in that the check-in desk didn't sit flush against the wall behind it. There was a gap, no wider than a hand, where the desk should have been flush to the log wall but wasn't, hidden behind decades of built-up dust and a fallen curtain nobody had moved. He spent 2 full days working the desk loose without breaking it, brushing away rot with the patience of a man who understood that some things deserved to be uncovered slowly instead of torn open. Behind the desk, built into the log wall itself, was a shallow cavity, no bigger than a bread box, sealed with a thin board that had been cut to match the grain of the logs around it so perfectly that unless you already knew to look, you would never see the seam at all. Inside was a ledger, the leather gone soft and dark with age, and a coffee can full of cash. Not much, maybe $300 in worn small bills, and a stack of letters tied with baling twine, addressed every one of them to Doreen. Never mailed, never sent. Just kept, year after year, in the wall behind a check-in desk on the loneliest stretch of highway in northern Manitoba. Doreen sat down on the dusty floor of that roadhouse and opened the ledger with her hands shaking so badly. Walter had to steady the can of coffee she'd forgotten she was holding. The ledger went back 31 years. Every page was the same format, in her father's careful, blocky handwriting, The handwriting of a man who had learned English late in life and wrote every letter like it cost him something. A date. A name, sometimes just an initial if the person hadn't wanted to give one. A single line describing who they were and why they'd come. And in the far column every single time the same 4 words. No charge. Room 14. A young mother running from a husband in Flin Flon with a baby and a black eye, given 3 nights and a hot meal and never charged a cent. A boy of 19 who'd hitchhiked out of a residential school placement and had nowhere on earth to go, given a bed for 2 weeks until Casimir found him work with a logging crew that treated him decently. A trucker who'd fallen asleep at the wheel outside and wrecked his rig in the ditch, given a room to sleep off the shock, no questions asked. Over and over, for 31 years the same room, the same silence, the same quiet act of a man giving shelter to strangers on a road so remote and so dark that if he hadn't been there, some of them, the ledger made clear, would simply not have made it through the night. And then the letters. 38 of them, one for every year since he'd left, each one addressed to a daughter he never once tried to contact directly. Because, the first letter explained, in that same careful, blocky hand, a man who works 12 14-hour days keeping a dying roadhouse alive for people who can't pay him. A man who took every dollar he ever made from his mechanic work and poured it into keeping that light burning at the edge of the Blackwater stretch. Had nothing left to offer a daughter except more of the same disappointment she'd already had enough of from him. He wrote that he had left because the bank had come for everything in swift current, and he could not stand for Doreen to watch her father fail in front of her. And he had gone north believing, in the particular broken logic of a proud and ashamed man, that a daughter was better off, believing her father had abandoned her than watching him lose the last of himself in front of her eyes. I am not a man who is good with people, one letter read in his blunt English. I could not tell you these things to your face because I do not have the words for it and never did. But I want you to know, if you ever find this, that every year I keep room 14 open. I am thinking of the year I did not keep the door open for you, and I am trying in my own poor way to make that right for someone else, because I cannot make it right for you. If you're crying right now, we understand, because half our team was crying reading this one for the first time too. Before we go further with Doreen's story, if there's someone in your life you've misunderstood, or someone who misunderstood you, maybe this is your sign to reach out to them tonight. And if this story is moving you the way we hope it is, hit that subscribe button, because we've got dozens more stories just like this one, waiting for you. Doreen read every letter that first night, sitting on the floor of the Roadhouse by the light of a battery lantern, because the power wasn't running yet, and Walter had gone home and left her alone with 38 years of a man's silence finally speaking. She read about the year Casimir had almost given up the Roadhouse to move back south and had changed his mind at the last minute because a family of Cree trappers had shown up in a whiteout with frostbite and nowhere else to go. She read about the year he'd been diagnosed with the heart condition that would eventually kill him, and how he'd written that he wasn't afraid of dying so much as he was afraid of room 14 finally going cold. She read his last letter, written 11 months before he died, in handwriting that had started, just to shake. I do not know if you will ever read this, Doreen. I do not know if you think of me at all, and if you hate me, I understand it, because I gave you every reason to. But I want you to know that I never once, not for a single day since I left that house in swift current, stopped being your father. I only stopped being able to show it. If there is anything left of this place when I am gone, I hope somebody keeps that room open. There are people on this road who need it, more than they need a business that makes money. There are always people on this road who need it. That is the only thing I ever understood clearly in my whole life. Doreen did not sleep that night. She sat in that roadhouse until the sun came up gray and cold over the spruce trees, and something in her that had been closed for 38 years. Closed the day her aunt told her men like that don't come back. Closed tighter the day Glenn left a sticky note on the fridge. Came open, slowly, the way frozen ground gives way in April, one small crack at a time. She thought about her aunt, dying now in Yorkton, who had kept the truth in an envelope for 11 years. Because she couldn't bring herself to forgive a dead man either. She thought about Glenn, and how strange it was that the 2 men who had left her, 38 years apart, had left for such different reasons, and had left her with such different casavier. One had left her with $400 and a sticky note, and the other, it turned out, had left her a door that had never once in 31 years stopped being open. We want to tell you here what happened next, because we think it's the part that really matters, more than any ledger or hidden letter. Doreen did not sell the Roadhouse. She thought about it for about a week, because $11,000 was not enough to fix a 40-year-old building on a remote highway, and any sensible person would have taken whatever a scrapyard or a land developer offered and gone somewhere warm to start over. But she kept thinking about that empty hook, number 14, and about a man who had given away rooms to strangers his whole life, while his own daughter believed he'd given away nothing at all. She used what was left of her settlement money and a small loan Walter Feshuk co-signed for her without her even asking, because he said her father had once fixed his truck for free during the worst winter of his life, and he'd been waiting 30 years for a way to pay it back. She fixed the roof first, then the plumbing, then the wood stove, and she reopened 4 of the 14 original rooms by the following winter, running the Roadhouse the same simple way her father had. A bed, a hot meal, a light in the window, for whoever came off that highway needing one. She kept the ledger going in a new notebook, in her own handwriting now, recording the truckers and the hunters and the young couple whose car broke down 40 kilometers from the nearest town, and who she pulled off the highway herself in her own Civic at 11 o'clock at night, because that was simply what you did now. That was what the Northern Star was for. And she kept room 14 exactly the way her father had kept it. No charge ever for anyone who needed it and couldn't pay. She still keeps a small brass key on that same hook, and if you ever find yourself broken down on the Blackwater stretch outside Thompson, Manitoba, in the dead of a northern winter, with nowhere else to go, there's a woman there now who will open that door for you and ask you nothing at all, because a man she spent 38 years believing had abandoned her taught her, in the end, without ever once saying it to her face, that the truest thing anyone can leave behind isn't money, and it isn't a house, and it isn't even an apology. It's a light left burning for the next person who needs one, kept faithfully, year after year, by someone who was once so sure they'd been left in the dark themselves. Doreen Kowalchuk was 56 years old, and her husband of 29 years left her with $412 and a sticky note on the refrigerator. She inherited a $1 Roadhouse from a father she believed had abandoned her for 38 years. It was the best dollar anyone ever spent, because a legacy was never the things a person owns. It's the door they leave open, the room they never charge for, and the light they keep burning on the coldest road in the country, for someone they will never meet and never need to. Keep 14 open. If this story found something in you tonight, share it with somebody who needs to hear it, and tell us down in the comments where you're watching from across this country. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. We'll see you on the next quiet road.